Family and Caregiver Open Forum, questions and answers from those living with brain injury. Moderated by Carolyn Rocchio.
We have some questions that I want to pose to start with, and then we'll take your questions from the audience. Well, this one happens to be from a survivor. Is it normal to be concerned that I'm making a big deal out of nothing after my brain injury, especially when I have no immediate apparent physical injuries?
You know, after you experience such a traumatic injury, there's grief and loss associated with that, not only for the survivor, but the survivor's family members, right? I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. So I certainly don't think that it is unusual to make a big deal out of the injury, the experience. I think that it's very important to move through the grief and loss process, which has many stages, and it's a roller coaster ride. So I think it's probably a very normal reaction to a very abnormal, life-changing event. So it sounds like I would recommend being more easy on yourself and just ride the wave.
I think also it's not at all uncommon that persons with brain injuries experience a very egocentric kind of life. I mean, it's hard to move on sometimes after brain injury. They know themselves very well and tend to often focus on themselves. It's not uncommon. I wouldn't worry about it. And like Dr. Caulfield said, you know, you got to have some space and time to learn to deal with your new self. Beth?
But I would also caution, we had a family in here this morning who said that it was a more than daily occurrence for their survivor to talk about their injury in great detail. Check yourself and see, are you doing this to your caregivers every single day, several times a day? Just do some self-checking to make sure you're not in a state of perseveration, as they say, repeating the same thing over and over again, because that will chase people away. And the one thing you don't want to do is chase people away. You want to make friends.
What about life expectancy? What is old age like?
When my John was injured in 1981, I think the lawsuit was in 91. And at that time, he was told, or we were told by both, well, Mike Howard, actually, the neuropsychologist, that he had a normal life expectancy as long as he was well cared for. And he's 48 now. He was injured at 15. And he is healthy. He really, really is. He takes the only meds he takes are blood pressure meds and the usual supplements. And I think that holds fairly true for most of them. Now, what was not addressed, and I would love to see it addressed, and perhaps someone else knows more about it than I certainly do, but I understand that early onset dementias of various kinds, as well as Parkinson's, can play into someone with a severe head injury, which is what my son had.
My dad had a stroke at age 70. He was a widower, lived alone, and experienced a stroke and was not found for 4 days. And so in his period of being in and out of consciousness, he fell twice. He spent that 4 days confined to his bedroom, hit an end table or a bedside table and then a tub. And so he has struggled a lot. It's been 14 years since his stroke, but he has gone into early dementia. It came on quite quickly. There were no signs of it prior to that, and now lives in a memory care unit. So I don't know, I mean, they haven't made a direct connection to that, but I do think it certainly felt like it was hastened a bit by the stroke.
There's over 30 types of dementia, and depending upon what type, for example, vascular with the stroke issues David's father suffered can be in any part of the brain depending upon where the bleed was. So that will then directly affect what the consequences, which area was affected, what the consequences of that stroke will look like. So it's depending upon the type of dementia as to where it might manifest and so on. So
a lot of our kids or family members hit their head in the frontal lobe.
yes.
So I guess my question is, what does the future bring? I mean, older people, the frontal lobe deteriorates quick anyway, correct?
Not necessarily, it just depends. But with frontal lobe, a lot of the brain injuries have what they call coup-contre-coup effect. And so with the impact on the frontal lobe and then back and hitting the back of the head. So depending upon the severity of both, if your loved one suffered the coup-contre-coup, which is generally, it's not unusual to have that, it's going to depend upon then the manifestation. But as far as aging process and what that's going to look like as time goes on, if the brain has been compromised, and this is true with brain disease, including depression, etc., you have the literature supports that there is more of a risk for early onset dementia. Okay.
30 years ago, when Alzheimer's was really in its infancy, as was treatment for traumatic brain injury, we didn't have any idea. There was some research that started after probably mid-80s about whether persons with brain injury were at higher risk for forms of dementia. I think that's pretty well established now that they are at higher risk. Not necessarily, I mean, you know, a certain percentage of us, due to genetics and other factors, may develop Alzheimer's as we age anyway. But persons with brain injury probably have a higher risk factor. There is a genetic test, a genotype that you can do if you're just curious. Now, number one, they don't have all the markers yet for Alzheimer's, but out of curiosity, I had my son tested because there is Alzheimer's in one side of my family. He does not have the current markers that are out there, but he has the risk for dementia due to the brain injury. So,
Is it a blood test?
It's a blood test, yeah. Oh, you had a question?
Yes.
I was just going to say, when you were saying all the different types of dementia, my mom broke her hip when she was in her 80s, and she had surgery, and when she came out of surgery, she had anesthesia-induced dementia and was never the same.
Yeah, there's many different kinds. Do you ever recommend the reduction of medications in an effort to help the person with TBI get off of them? It's a two-part. Do you ever recommend the use of hyperbaric chamber for persons with TBI?
I have a friend who is a retired Army general who suffered a traumatic brain injury when he was in Afghanistan. And he had hyperbaric treatment outside of his treatment because the VA does not recognize hyperbaric treatment. And he swears by it. So I understand that there's a lot of controversy about it, but it is out there, it is available. I think some people have had some great success with it. I certainly think it's worth investigating.
Yeah, there is, like Lester says, a lot of controversy about it. I've seen it make some changes in the early stages. And you have to wonder, is that spontaneous recovery, or is the hyperbaric oxygenation making a change? I don't know. To me, the jury is still out. Although, like Lester says, some people that have had it swear by it. And as far as reduction of medications, Beth?
Yeah. As I said, my John is 30-some years post, and last year and the year before, his neurologist asked if I wanted to titrate him off of Tegretol for seizures. And he had had a massive seizure and little seizures way back in the 80s and early 90s. And he said, if you take him off the Tegretol, it's like, he felt it was like lifting a cloud off his head. And I have a great deal of faith in his neurologist, and I said, well, let's try it. And I know how to look for seizures. I think that's the key. Not only your doctor, but your own education before you do any medication changing on your own. We took him off of his seizure medication, and I have seen no seizures. I did think I saw some irritability, but I think that's gone away. I think that may have been mother-induced.
Using Tegretol does leach calcium out of the blood, out of the bones, I'm sorry. And it often will result in the need to do a bone density, even on males. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, the medical correspondent for CNN, promotes that. I had to talk my doctor into doing a bone density on my son because he said, it isn't going to show anything. Oh yeah, it did, because he had been on Tegretol for a long time. And we ended up putting him on Fosamax, and he used to say, me and all the menopausal women are on Fosamax. But it did rebuild the bone, so that was the important thing.
This question is, post-TBI behavior sometimes mimics pre-TBI behavior. Lazy, apathetic, no initiative. Should we be more tolerant or treat him as we did before, not being very tolerant of that behavior? My recommendation would be to talk to your doctor about this. It could be the result of some depression post-TBI. It's hard not knowing this person and the specifics of before versus after, but if you're noticing the continued behavior and it's interfering with his ability to move forward as you would hope, or it's causing some family issues, I would certainly discuss it with your physician, the neurologist or neuropsychologist, psychologist, and they may or may not recommend some antidepressants or another form of medication to address those issues.
I can certainly speak to behavioral disorders. My son suffered a severe brain injury 30 years ago. He was in a coma for more than 5 months. He has always had severe behavioral disorders. He has been on every medication known to man, and simply nothing controls them. He's been in and out of various living facilities. Some have not been able to handle him. They have medically managed him. It's just been a nightmare. And currently, he is in a wonderful facility in Miami. He's at it's a United Cerebral Palsy facility, and this arrangement was brought about by the Brain and Spinal Cord Injury Program. And he's just doing great because, you know what, his behavioral disorders to them are virtually nothing. So it's just interesting to me that after, he's been there now for 2 years, 28 years, it's not the medication, it's the environment. And he is literally thriving for the first time. It's just amazing. So it's just, you know, it's interesting too. I have a friend whose son was injured about 2 years ago. They used virtually no medication on him from the beginning. And so here he is 2.5 years later. He does have some behavioral disorders, but he and his family are learning to control it again with his environment. So things change, and we have to keep an open mind.
How old was your son at the time?
He was 18. He's older than I am now.
Beth, do you want to comment on that?
Every traumatic brain injury is unique. And so whether you tolerate the behavior or not, a lot depends on on how that is affecting him and the family. But I will say, Lester mentioned environment, and a structured environment, a structured day, with all the components in it that it needs, including productive activity, social, if you can get something going, and you start small and build up. That will make a big difference in that behavior of the survivor.
That is absolutely key. They cannot structure their own day. They need the structure imposed. And sometimes families say, I can't do it. We can't always have meals at a certain time of the day. But you'd be surprised. When my son came out of rehab, he was in a very strict structure. And believe me, I am the mistress of behavior. He was horrible. For a year and a half, I thought I would kill him. And he was in a program out in California for 14 months, which did a lot for him. But actually, we had more trouble when he got home because he knew the person he was before he was injured. He didn't like the person he had become. And if it weren't for the structure, I think I probably would have killed him. But to this day, 30 years later, we have meals at a certain time in order to prevent him from overeating because he has damage in the hypothalamus. He has a snack at 3 o'clock if he wants it and one at 9 o'clock. And he's so structured that if I gave him a snack, I said, here's your snack at 2:30 in the afternoon, he'd say, nope, not 3 o'clock yet. So it can be done. It's really hard and it takes a lot out of you. But if you can get a structure in place and keep them occupied with some meaningful activities. But the other thing that the missing key is, as a family, hopefully your family member has had a neuropsychological evaluation, which often takes probably 6 hours and should be spread out over a couple of day period. But the important part of that is, did anyone ever sit down with you and discuss the results? Do you know your family members' abilities and deficits? And you play to the abilities and you try to ignore the deficits, or you hopefully develop some compensatory strategies to make those deficits less important. A neuropsychologist is a specialist in brain behavior relationships. There is no standard neuropsychological assessment. A neuropsychologist can pick and choose from the Halstead, Reitan, a number of neuropsychological assessments that are available. They can kind of pick their favorites, but it tells you a lot about how that person, after being injured, how their brain is functioning. And that's key. You know, you don't want to say to somebody, you can do it, just try harder. If they can't do it, they can't do it, and you've got to help them learn a new way to do some of the things they're no longer able to do. How do I know when my son is able to drive again? He seems so normal.
It's an ongoing battle, but I don't think that John has asked to drive now in several years. I think he finally, after many doctor's visits for his vision, many falls because of his balance, and he's just become more aware of his deficits over this long period of time. But it is a tough one, and one of the things that a lot of people have done is say, fine, but you have to pass a test. And you take them to an occupational therapist and you get the test run. And let the occupational therapist tell them that no, you're not ready to drive, or no, you cannot ever drive, depending on what their deficits are. And this question comes up a lot with the men. I've never known it to come up with the women.
In my experience with my son, in the early years, he would ask to drive. And then, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 years after, I said to him, okay, let's give it a shot. we'll go to a parking lot, an empty parking lot, and I drive a stick shift. I always have. My children learned to drive on a stick shift. And I was driving a little Volkswagen Beetle. And we got to this empty parking lot. And I said, okay, remember the clutch, this and that. He's sitting in the passenger seat. And I got out and I walked around. And he said, no, Mom, I can't drive.
It's a difficult situation for you to be in the hot seat saying no, you can't, and getting into that power struggle. So another professional that you can take your loved one to is a neuropsychologist, and my mother and I did this with my father, actually, who had some brain injury, strokes, and TBIs, and so on. And so the neuropsychologist did testing, and that day he said, Mr. Caulfield, your testing results, I can tell you right now, are telling me that there's extensive frontal lobe damage, and I want you to hand your keys over to your wife. I will be reporting you to the Department of Transportation that you're never to drive again, and do you understand what I'm saying, etc. So the doctor, the neuropsychologist, was the one sharing that news, and doesn't put you in the hot seat of, again, getting into that power struggle with that issue.
There are certified driving educators, and you can usually find them at any good brain and spinal cord injury rehabilitation hospital. They can sure deliver the news, and actually they are required, if you fail the test, to report that to Department of Motor Vehicles and have your license revoked. I saw that early on when my son I was sitting behind him, and the occupational therapist was assessing his perceptual capabilities. And I saw his left igneural. He lost his right eye. But mostly, they can all operate a car after they're injured. That's not the issue. It's their ability, judgment, reasoning, reaction time, being able to follow all those cars going past you on the road. They're not safe, and you really need to have them evaluated. And the day that I saw how deficit Tim was, I said that would really be scary. And he says to me today, coming up the interstate, he said, oh God, I'm so glad I don't have to drive. So it can be done, but you really gotta belabor the issue of, oh, I know you can still mechanically operate a car, but are you safe? A certified driver's educator knows what to test for before they ever they won't even take you on the road. So I think you're gonna find, if it's a certified driver educator, you're going to get all the proper testing before you actually get on the road. Doctors have an obligation also, like neurologists you might be seeing, neuropsychologists. Once they've told you should not be driving, many of the better ones will notify Department of Motor Vehicles. Yeah.
So each of the memory disorder clinics have in their ability to do driver testing on a computer. And I know you're talking about memory impairment, but it's a very inexpensive test. It's usually, some of them do offer it for free, and some offer it for $50 to $60. Whereas the occupational test in our hospital is about $400, and insurance does not pay for it. So what happens is, with this test, it's a preliminary to say, like, if you fail that test, there's no way you're going to drive, there's no way you're actually going to be able to do the occupational one, because it's computer generated. So that would be another avenue people could look for if they're questioning the ability of a person to drive. There's 12 memory disorder clinics, so each of them are locally close to all of you, where you wouldn't have to go a far distance to get the test done.
One of the things that Josie reminded me of, a long time ago, somebody said to me, how would you like it if every morning when you woke up, somebody said to me, oh, for heaven's sakes, you've done this wrong, you've done that wrong, you got out of bed on the wrong side, whatever the survivor has done wrong, brushed their teeth wrong. That is not a nice way to wake up. So it's the pat on the back, and it is important. And I remember also Carolyn Rocchio a long time ago telling me to remember to be kind. And I think all these little things, they're rolling around in my head, and I try my best to use them all the time, and I'm sure Lester does too. Come on, Lester, give us your secrets.
Well, I always wanted my son to be able to accept his disabilities and, quote, move on. And because he always was talking about, when am I going to get well, Mom? When am I going to get well? And Valerie Breen made the comment to me a few years ago, something about the resiliency of the human spirit. And I'm telling you, that completely turned me around towards my attitude towards him. I am so glad that he still thinks he's going to get well, because he still tries, and he tries, and he tries, and he works hard. And you know what? He is better. So going back to what you said, you know, we need to remember, this is not the person that I used to know, but for Christ's sakes, my son was 18 years old when he was hurt. That was 30 years ago. I've known him longer with a brain injury than I did without a brain injury. So this person that I have is a wonderful person. And you know, he has a very rich life too. He confabulates gloriously. I mean gloriously. This man has a personal relationship with Jimi Hendrix, and they talk every day. I mean, it is just amazing. So, you know, I'm not sure what my point is here, except that life does go on, and it does go on gloriously.
My husband's been gone for 20 years. Tim constantly tells me, Dad and I saw, it'll be the latest movie out. So, you know, if he makes him happy, it makes me happy. Audrey.
Well, we're concerned about long-term, what's going to happen when we're not here. Our son is 27, and we know that he will probably never live independently, and we don't know what to do. I mean, we're considering, you know, when my parents pass away, because we're kind of caring for them also, of moving to another state. I don't know if that will help. You know, if we could get Medicaid and establish residency somewhere there and have him have Medicaid, and then maybe he could be in a group home, you know, or we could plan for that.
If the onset of the disability began before 18 or under, then you're eligible for developmental services, which is a whole different menu. Of course, my son doesn't qualify, nor does yours. Beth's son, oh yeah, that's right, he did, yeah, because he was 15.
But the waiting list is like this long.
Yeah, and as far as moving to another state, do you know, when I was doing the family callbacks for the Brain Injury Association, every year toward the end of November, everyone in New York called wanting to move to Florida and wanted to know what Medicaid offered in Florida. Nothing. And they were New York Medicaid's the best in the nation. And they planned to move to Florida and retire, and they expected that their person with a brain injury could receive the same services.
As you just said, we all face what you're facing. So my son does not get developmentally disabled dollars. He gets a Medicaid waiver because he was over 18. And that too is shrinking. So my advice is we need to pay attention to what's happening in our state legislature, and you need to be rapping on your legislator, you know, for coverage for these folks.
My son is 30 years post-injury. He can't take care of himself. He needs 24/7, and you know, the cost of care in a highly specialized brain injury program is anywhere from $100,000 up annually. So, you know, you can't be expected. It's a tough nut that I don't think anybody has any good answers for. Beth, you have any ideas on that?
Well, I agree with Rich and Audrey. You don't want to burden your other children. You know what it has taken out of your life to do this.
So
and
do So do they.
Yes, they do. You are right on that. They are aware. that they are sometimes a burden. And I try to dispel that, but sometimes it's the truth. And so I don't have any answers either. I really don't. And in fact, I had to go in and see John's attorney a couple of weeks ago to sign off on the guardianship report. And he came in and he said, I need to talk to your son Daniel for a couple of hours when he has time. And I said, well, I'll make time. Why? And he said, well, it's time for him to stop being trained to be the guardian. I said, do I look that bad? But anyway, he's right. I am 75.
You're just a kid.
Yeah, right. But I don't. Has anybody in the room started to make a concrete plan? I have.
Me.
Yeah, well, I have too, to a degree, but my concrete plans are airy-fairy, if you will. It depends on this person doing this and this person doing this. And the best I have come up with, a solid plan, is for John to stay right where he is. The house is his. He owns the house. And for my other sons to watch over home care services coming in. That would be the least disruptive and keep him where he is happiest.
To learn more about resources and information provided by our experts, call Brain Injury Association of Florida's helpline at 800-992-3442.